A little girl was found guarding her dead mother's body, in a blizzard refusing to leave. The lantern was out of oil. I know that's where my mind goes first, even now, not the child, not the cold, not the woman frozen in the snow. The lantern, because that's what I saw first coming over the ridge, nothing. No light, no smoke from the chimney of the Haverson line shack, which should have been there. I'd ridden that stretch of fence line often enough to know what the shack's light looked like in a storm, a small amber smear through the white. There was nothing. I nearly turned back. I was 53 years old that November. My knees ached in the cold, and I had a horse with a bad tendon I was trying to keep to a walk, and the storm had been building since noon. The sheriff's office back in Crail had no business sending me out past the valley in weather like that. But they did, and I went, because that's what I'd been doing for 30 years, going when they sent me, even when there was no sense in it. Even when I knew they only sent me because everyone younger had the good judgment to stay warm. I almost missed her. She was on the south side of the shack, against the wood stack, and she'd pulled a piece of canvas tarp over herself and over. I didn't understand right away. I saw the canvas move in the wind, and I thought it was loose, thought it had blown there from somewhere, and then I saw the boot. Small boot, a child's boot, brown leather, the sole worn almost through at the toe. I got down off the horse, and my knees damn near buckled in the snow, and I pulled the canvas back. She looked up at me, 6 years old, maybe 7, dark hair frozen to her cheeks, eyes so steady it frightened me worse than if she'd been screaming. She had both arms around her mother's body, and she had her chin out like she was daring me to try to take the woman away. I said, "I'm Marshall Cord Whitaker. I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't say anything. I said, "Your mama's gone, sweetheart." "I know," she said, very small voice, very sure. "I've been keeping her warm." There's no good answer to that. I've thought about it for going on 4 years, and I still don't have one, so I didn't try. I just crouched there in the snow next to this child and her dead mother in the dark, and I said, "You want to come inside with me?" "I can't leave her. I'll bring her inside, too." She looked at me for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring in my face, I don't know what she found, but she loosened her arms just enough and said, "All right." Her name was Nora Calloway. Her mother was Margit Calloway, who had come from the Minnesota Territory 8 years before, married a homesteader named Thomas Calloway, and been widowed 2 years after Nora was born when Thomas's horse rolled on him crossing the Miller Creek ford. Margit had kept the claim alone through 5 winters, and she was dead now at 32 years old from a burst of something internal. Her daughter had told me, because her mother had been coughing blood for a week, and then stopped coughing and went asleep and didn't wake up. I learned all of that from Nora in bits and pieces across the first 3 days, while she sat wrapped in a horse blanket at the table in the line shack and ate whatever I put in front of her and watched me with those steady dark eyes. She was not a child who cried easily. She cried twice that I saw, once when I laid her mother out proper on the cot and covered her with a sheet, and once 4 days later when the storm finally broke and I had to tell her we were going to town. She said, "What happens to me in town?" "The county'll find you somewhere." She considered this like an orphanage. "Maybe, or a family." "I don't want either of those." I said, "Nora, I don't have much say in it." She looked at me the way she'd looked at me that first night in the snow. "You're the marshal." "That doesn't mean—" "You're the marshal," she said again, as if saying it twice settled an argument. I don't know why I didn't take her straight to Crail. The storm was partly it, and then the horse's tendon, and then there was the matter of what to do with Margit's body in frozen ground. But there was something else. I'd been alone in my house in Crail for 11 years, since my wife Ruth died of a fever in the summer of 1871. No children, no family closer than Nebraska. I'd grown into a man who was good at being alone, or at least practiced at it, which isn't the same thing, and I knew the difference. But there was something about this child who had sat in a blizzard for 2 days and 2 nights, keeping watch over her dead mother, and refused to leave. I took her to Crail the 2nd week of November. I did it the right way, talked to the county clerk, filled out the papers, told them she was there and needed placement. They put her in the Burris household on the east side of town, with a family that had 4 children already and a husband who looked at Nora like she was one more thing to feed. She lasted 9 days. She showed up at my door on a Thursday evening in the first week of December with her coat buttoned wrong and a bruise on her jaw that she told me she got walking into a door. I looked at her for a second, and then I stepped aside and let her in. I sent word to the county clerk that Nora Calloway was in my house, and I'd be keeping her until her kin could be located. The clerk wrote back that I had no legal standing, and I wrote back that I was the law in this county, and if he wanted to come discuss it, he was welcome to come discuss it. He didn't come. The kin they found was her mother's sister, a woman named Clara Voss, who taught school in a town called Granby, Missouri, and who received the letter about Margit in late November, and who arrived in Crail on the 16th of December on the afternoon stage with 2 trunks and a face like she'd been holding something tightly since she got the news. I met the stage. I always met the stage when I was in town. It was part of the job, or I'd made it part of the job, because a marshal who knows who's coming and going knows a great deal. But I met this one because Nora was sitting on the bench outside the office, and she hadn't said much since I'd told her about the letter, and I thought someone ought to be there who knew how to stand still. Clara Voss came down the stage steps and looked around and saw Nora, and her face went. Just went. She crossed the street without looking, and she went down on her knees in the frozen mud, and she put her arms around the child, and Nora, who I'd seen cry exactly twice in 5 weeks, made a sound I'd never heard from her. I stood back. Clara Voss stayed on her knees in the cold mud for a while. Then she stood up and she turned and looked at me with Nora's hand in hers, and she said, "You're Marshal Whitaker." "Yes, ma'am." "Nora wrote me about you." She said it plain, no inflection I could read. "She wrote you." "She can write, Margit taught her." She paused. "She said you let her keep her mother's Bible." "It was hers to keep." Clara Voss looked at me a moment longer, then felt comfortable. She was 30 or so, plain-faced, brown hair going to gray at the temples earlier than it had any right to. She had good eyes, the kind that don't look away from things. "I'd like to see where she's been staying," she said. I brought them both to my house. It was not much of a house. A marshal's pay in Crail wasn't the kind that built you anything worth seeing. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. But I'd had a fire going and there was coffee, and I'd swept the floors that morning for reasons I hadn't examined too closely. Clara Voss walked through both rooms without comment. She stood in the lean-to kitchen and looked at the shelf where I'd put the Bible and the small wooden horse that had been in Nora's coat pocket, and the 2 books from the lined shack that had been Margit's. She looked at all of that for a while. Then she sat down at the table and she said, "Tell me what happened." So I told her, all of it the way it had actually been, not the version I'd written in the county report. The lantern, the boot, the canvas tarp, what Nora had said about keeping her mother warm. I told it plain, and I watched her face while I did, and she didn't look away from any of it. When I finished, she sat quiet for a moment. Then she said, 2 days and 2 nights. "Best I could figure." "In that storm?" "Yes, ma'am." She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "She's like her mother," she said, mostly to herself. "Margit was the same way. Once she decided something was right, she wouldn't move off it." She looked up. "What do you intend to do with her?" I said, "That depends on what you intend." "I intend to take her back to Missouri with me. She can come to school with me until we sort out the legal matter of the claim." She paused. "Unless you have an objection." I didn't have an objection, not a legal one. I sat with that for a second and didn't say anything. Clara Voss watched me. "You've been looking after her for 6 weeks, she said. 5 weeks on your own. She's easy to look after. Mostly she reads." There was a silence. Nora was in the other room with the wooden horse, moving it along the windowsill the way she did sometimes in the evenings. We could both hear it. Clara Voss said, "She told me you read to her." "Evenings when I'm not on call." I looked at the table. "She asked." "She said you read her the book of Job." "She picked it. I thought she'd want something lighter." I paused. "She said she wanted something honest." Something shifted in Clara Voss's face. Not softening exactly, it was already a face without much hardness in it, but something coming closer to the surface. She said, "That's very like her." She stayed 3 days in the beginning. She had a room at the hotel, which was really just 2 rooms above Pelton's dry goods, and she came by the house in the mornings and sat with Nora, and they talked about Margit and talked about Granby, and she took Nora out in the afternoons to walk around the town. I gave them their time. I had work to do. On the 3rd morning she came alone, early, before Nora was up. I was in the lean-to with coffee, and she knocked and came in and she said, "I have a question and I want you to answer it honestly." All right. The Burris family, the bruise on Nora's jaw. I looked into it. And I made clear to Mr. Burris that it would be in his interest not to handle children in a particular way. She waited. He took me seriously, I said. She held her coffee cup in both hands and looked out the Lenta window at the frozen yard. She said, "Did you go there in the middle of the night?" I did. Alone? Yes. She looked at me for a moment. "You've been doing this work for a long time," she said. It wasn't a question. 30 years, near enough. Is there a Mrs. Whittaker? There was. She's been gone 11 years. She nodded once, slow. I'm sorry, she said, and it was the kind of sorry that doesn't want anything back. She left on the 5th day. She took Nora with her, which was the right thing, and I knew it was the right thing. Nora hugged me at the stage, a hard, sudden hug that caught me off balance, her face against my coat, and then she let go and climbed up without looking back, which was also very like her. Clara Voss shook my hand. She had a firm grip. She said, "I'll write when we're settled." I said, "You don't have to do that." She said, "I know I don't have to." She looked at me with those steady eyes. "I want to." The stage left. I watched it go down the street and around the curve at the hardware, and then it was gone, and the street was just a street again, cold and ordinary, with a few people going about their business, and none of them thinking about anything I was thinking about. I went back to work. The letter came in March. 3 pages in a neat schoolteacher's hand, mostly about Nora, how she'd settled into the schoolroom, how she'd made one particular friend, a girl named Bess who was also, Clara said, the kind of child who doesn't laugh easily, so naturally they'd found each other. She wrote about the claim, which was going to be a legal tangle. She wrote about Granby, which was smaller than Crail but had a decent library. She wrote about her brother-in-law's opinion that she should not be corresponding with a frontier marshal she'd met twice, and that she had informed him she was 31 years old and would correspond with whomever she liked. At the bottom she had written, "Nora asks about you every few days. She wants to know if you still have the roan with the bad tendon. I don't know how to answer her, so I thought I'd ask." I wrote back, the roan was better. The tendon had healed up through the winter with rest, and I'd been using him again since February, easy work. I wrote 2 pages, which was more than I'd written to anyone in years. I said Crail had had a quiet winter. I said the Burris children seemed to be doing all right. I said I was glad Nora had found a friend. I did not say I had thought about this child every day since the stage left. I did not say the 2 books from the line shack were still on the shelf. I did not say anything about what it had been like to come home in the evenings to a quiet house again after 5 weeks of it not being quiet. But I kept writing. She kept writing back. By summer, the letters were weekly. She wrote well, direct, a little dry, with a humor that showed up sideways in the middle of something else, and then was gone before you could point at it. She wrote about the children she taught and the problems of small-town politics, which were no different from small-town politics anywhere. She wrote about Nora's progress and about the claim, which was slowly being resolved through a lawyer in St. Paul who charged too much and moved too slowly. She wrote once about her husband, who had died 4 years before of a lung sickness quickly, and who had been, she said in about a sentence, a decent man who she had been fond of. I wrote about the work. I wrote about the country, which I knew in a way that is hard to put in words, the way a man knows something he's given most of his life to, and I found that she was interested in it, really interested, not politely. She asked questions about things I'd mentioned, and I'd answer them, and she'd ask more. Nobody had been interested in what I knew about this country for a long time. The men I worked with were interested in it too, but the way you're interested in weather, practically, from the outside. She was interested the way you're interested in something you want to understand. In September, she wrote that Nora had asked, very seriously, whether Marshal Whittaker might come to visit sometime. And then she'd added, "I find I'd like to know what you'd answer." I sat with that letter for 2 days. I wrote back, I could come in October between the cattle drives if it would be convenient. She wrote back, it would be convenient. I rode the train to Missouri. I hadn't ridden a train since '74, and I'd forgotten how much I disliked it, the noise, the confinement, the smell of coal smoke and other men. But I got there. Granby was a real town, more than I'd expected from her descriptions, a proper main street, a church with a bell tower, a schoolhouse on a low hill at the north end of town that I could see from the station. Clara met me at the station with Nora, who shook my hand very formally and then told me the roan sounded like a good horse. I said, he's a better horse than he deserves to be. Nora looked at me and nearly smiled. She didn't smile easily, which I'd known, but nearly was something. Clara lived in a small house 2 streets back from the school. She had a parlor with good books in it and a kitchen that smelled like bread, and she'd made dinner, a real dinner, a roast with potatoes and a pie with apples from a neighbor's tree. We ate and talked, and Nora went to bed at her usual hour without being asked, which Clara said with a certain quiet satisfaction was a recent development. After Nora was in bed, we sat in the parlor. Clara had a glass of cider and I had coffee, and we talked more easily than I'd expected, which is to say about the same as the letters, which had never been stiff. At some point she said, "Can I ask you something?" "You've been asking me things for most of a year," I said. "True," she looked at her glass. "When you came over that ridge in November and the lantern was out, you said in the letter you almost turned back." "I did almost turn back. What made you keep going?" "I thought about it. I don't know exactly. I knew something was wrong. I've written that line enough to know what right looks like, and right wasn't there." I paused. "And there was, I don't know, something in the storm. That line shack had somebody in it, I knew that, and turning back on somebody felt like one particular kind of thing I didn't want to be." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nora said you picked her up and carried her inside, that you didn't drop her once, even on the ice." "She remembers that." "She told me about it twice." Clara looked at me. "She said she knew she was safe because you didn't drop her." "I didn't say anything." "I think that's why she trusts you," Clara said. "She trusts physical evidence. She doesn't trust words very much. Her mother was the same." She turned the glass in her hands. "I am not the same. I trust words. I read letters and I know something about a person from how they write." "And what did you know about me?" She considered it. "That you're a man who does the thing that needs doing and doesn't expect to be thanked for it, and that you're lonelier than you let on." She said it plain, not unkind. "Both of those things can be true at once." I looked at the fire. She was right, and I knew she was right, and I didn't see the point in arguing with something she'd gotten right. I said, "What did you do when you got the letter about Margit?" "I sat down," she said. "I sat down and I read it 3 times, and then I sat there for a while." She paused. "We didn't see each other often, Margit and I, the distance, but she was my sister. She was the person I grew up beside." She stopped and started again. "The letter said there was a child and that the child was with a marshal named Whitaker who seemed to be looking after her. I thought, I'll know when I get there what kind of man that is." She looked at me. "I knew when I got there." I said, "How did you know?" "The shelf," she said. "The shelf. With the Bible and the wooden horse and Margit's books." She was still looking at me. "You could have put those things in a box, put them away, but you put them on a shelf where Nora could see them every day. That's not something a man does without thinking about it." I hadn't thought about it. Or I had, but not in words. It had just been the obvious thing, and I hadn't considered whether it was obvious to everyone. I said it was her mother's. "Yes," Clara said quietly, "I know." The fire settled. Outside a dog barked once and then stopped. I said I thought about her, after she left most days. "She told me she thought about you." "I meant both of them." Clara looked at the fire, a long quiet moment, then she said, "So did I." I stayed 4 days. I met some of her neighbors and I walked through the town, and I spent 2 afternoons at the school while she taught, sitting in the back corner on a bench that was meant for a much smaller man, watching her work. She was good at it. Not performed good, not the kind of teacher who needs you to see them being a teacher. She was interested in the children in the particular way she was interested in everything. One at a time, the specific child. What that child needed. I watched her and I thought, here is a woman who has been doing the right thing quietly for a long time with nobody watching. The last evening, after Nora was in bed again, I said, "I'd like to come back." Clara said, "I was hoping you'd say that. The work keeps me in Crail most of the year." "I know that. I'm not a young man." "I'm aware." She looked at me with just the suggestion of something dry in it. "I have eyes." "I mean, I don't know what I'm offering that's worth much. I have a small house and a marshal's pay and a horse with a history." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When Nora came to me in December, she had a way of not asking for anything. She'd go without rather than ask. I spent the first few weeks trying to figure out what she needed and just providing it without making her ask. She paused. She said that's what you did, that you just knew what she needed and did it. She was easy to read. She isn't actually, she's very hard to read. Clara looked at me steadily. So how did you do it? I paid attention, I said. She held that for a moment. That, she said, is worth a great deal. We wrote through the winter. The letters were longer and the distance between them shorter, and by February I had stopped keeping them in the desk drawer and had started keeping them in my coat pocket, which is a thing I recognized for what it was. In April, she wrote that the claim had been settled and that Nora was fully hers in law now. She wrote, I told her, and she said, good, that's correct. And then she went back to her reading. She wrote, I think she's going to be all right. I think she's going to be more than all right. In May, I wrote, I have some leave coming in June. I'd like to use it in Granby if you'll have me. She wrote back the same week, I'll have you. I came back in June. It was different than October, warmer and greener and more settled, less like a visit, more like something else. I helped Clara fix a section of fence at the back of her yard that had been leaning since winter. Nora helped, handing me the wire and tools with the same quiet steadiness she'd had at 6 years old in a blizzard. And now she was 8 and she was growing into the person she was going to be, and it was a good person. I could see it already. One evening, the three of us ate outside at the yard table, and the light went late the way it does in June, and Nora fell asleep in her chair between the meal and the dark. Clara and I sat there after and drank coffee and didn't talk much, which is its own kind of ease when you've earned it. After a while, Clara said, Nora drew a picture at school. Her teacher asked the children to draw their families. What did she draw? Clara looked at me. She drew you and me and herself in front of a house. I sat with that. What house? I said finally. I asked her the same thing. Clara's eyes were steady and warm and they were on me. She said, the one we'll live in, and she went back to her drawing. I looked at the yard, the last of the light going out of it, this child asleep in her chair with her face tilted toward the cooling air, at peace in the way only sleeping children are. And the way that peace sat in my chest was something I had not expected to feel again and had not thought I deserved. I said, what do you think about that? Clara said, I think she's probably right. She put her hand over mine on the table, a simple thing, her hand on my hand. She looked at me and there was nothing complicated in her face, just clear and certain and warm. I think she usually is. I turned my hand over so I was holding hers. The coffee cooled. The dark came up slowly across the yard. Nora slept in her chair and Clara's hand was in mine, and I sat there thinking about a ridge in a November storm and a lantern with no oil and how close I'd come to turning back, how close, and what would have been lost if I had. There's no way to calculate that. I've stopped trying. What I know is this, I did not turn back. I found them, this child and her dead mother, and I picked them up and I carried them in out of the cold and I didn't drop anything. And 4 years later, I was sitting in a yard in Missouri in the June dark, holding the hand of a woman who had ridden 2 days on a stage because her sister was gone and a child was alone, and I was the man she looked at like that. That is not something I could have planned. That is not something I was owed. But I had done a thing correctly in a storm when it would have been easy to turn back, and the world had not rewarded me. That's not the right word. The world had simply been, for once, what it should be. The thing that was right had turned out to also be the thing that led here. I will take that. I am still taking that. Nora woke up when the full dark came, and she looked around and saw us and went straight back to being awake without any of that slow confusion children usually have. She said, should I go inside? Clara said, if you like. She looked at us both with those dark eyes. She'd been looking at me with those dark eyes for 4 years, and I still didn't entirely know what she found there, but whatever it was, she seemed to have decided it was all right. She stood up and came around the table, and she put her arms around me for a moment, her chin on my shoulder, the way she'd done in front of the stage in Crail that December. Then she let go. Good night, Cord, she said. She'd started calling me that sometime in the past year. Good night, I said. She went inside and the door closed, and there was just the dark yard and the cooling air and Clara's hand still in mine. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there until it was fully dark, and the stars came out over Missouri. And I was an old marshal a long way from the country I'd always known, holding on to what the storm had led me to. I was not letting go,